Recently I picked up the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1 manga. I was a real big fan of the anime and just really wanted to have a physical copy to show my support for the writer Araki, but also just to read it. When I opened the first page, I was kind of taken by surprise. I was told that JoJo's anime is incredibly accurate in its adaptation of the manga. Panel to panel could almost be matched up with the anime's equivalent. But the first page of the manga was not seen in the anime at all. The only time you can see hints to it is at the ending screen of the first arc. This was probably done in order to pace up the show at the start. The start of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was written quite some time ago. In the manga, the first thing we see is a prologue depicting what looks like an Aztec sacrifice. Then showing the stone mask, and showing that the stone mask has granted the priest the power to drain life from an individual. Then it shows us an image of the mask. It straight up says this story is centered around this stone mask and the two boys whose fates are intertwined with it. This right off the bat takes away any mystery that has been set up in the first arc of JoJo. It removes any mystery surrounding the mask and therefore the rest of the plot. But there's something I noticed while reading the manga that wasn't necessarily apparent to me whatsoever during my time watching the show. There was two protagonists. Typically in shonen, the main character has either one of two archetypes: the cool, calculating, intelligent, and ruthless individual, but under the surface is driven by pure emotion and questionable motives. People like Yagami or Lelouch, or the hot-headed, childish character who has noble and honorable characteristics to them, and because the story is told in the form of shonen, teens and young adults most likely identify with the latter more commonly. That being said, it's no secret that Jonathan is the latter. A lot of people don't like Jonathan. I think one of the main problems with shonen stories in general is that most of their main characters are static, meaning that they have very little development in terms of their actual character. Not their journey or their influence, but the personal growth of the individual. But they are active characters and they seek out the plot. This does not apply to Jonathan. For the first section of this story, Jonathan is a reactive character, and traditionally, reactive characters are side characters. A good example of this would be Gohan from Dragon Ball Z. Throughout the main storyline of DBZ, up until the final fight with Cell, Gohan is a reactionary character. Gohan has no massive impact on the plot as a whole anyway, and anytime events happen where he does impact the plot, he reacts to his situation. He never causes main events to happen. He awaits for his moment, for his time to shine. Not because of his character, but because of the plot of the story. Jonathan is running strong in this story, but he is not, at least in the beginning, in first place. Dio is the main character of the first section of this series, thus the first JoJo. It's no secret that Dio has cemented himself as a more impactful character within the JoJo mythos that Jonathan has. And there's a really good reason as to why. From the moment Dio drops out of the wagon at the Joestar Mansion, he takes charge of the situation and the plot. In this moment, Dio shows Jonathan and the rest of us that he is the one the plot revolves around, and I find this incredibly intelligent writing. I've always found the direction of JoJo to be amazing. I believe Araki did these moves on purpose. I think it keeps you both interested in Dio and Jonathan. They're both likable, but for the opposite reasons. Jonathan, the ideal hero, noble type, but he's a one-note character. His personality is boring and very easy to predict. Dio, on the other hand, he's incredibly charismatic, witty, and an absolute meme, but fundamentally, he's a damaged and evil individual. The greed he inherited from his father consumes him to his frustration. As time goes on, he will become more and more like his father. Quick aside, I love how Speedwagon, we're not going to talk much about Speedwagon today, but Speedwagon is a nice moral bridge between Jonathan and Dio's characters. The low-life crime boss with a heart of gold. In the beginning, this show has a direct narrative, and it's Dio's objective, which is to take the Joestar fortune for himself. He plans to alienate everyone from Jonathan in order to gain George Joestar's favor. He succeeds first by beating Jonathan in a boxing match by cheating, and then using the attention and affection to spread false rumors about Jonathan. This makes his friends turn on him and favor Dio instead. Later on, Jonathan finds some reprieve from finding love with another. Dio notices that Jonathan is finding happiness and forces a kiss upon her, taking Jonathan's first kiss and, in Dio's eyes, corrupting her. It's very interesting how Dio sees this intentionally as corrupting her for Jonathan, but the second she tries to wash her mouth out with dirty water rather than have Dio's taint on her, a complete reflection of what he was doing, he becomes enraged. Once again, Jonathan reacts to this news. He takes the fight to Dio and puts him to the floor. For the first time, Dio is on his back, and he reacts with rage and emotion, pulling out his knife. A knife in this story is a pretty big deal. There's no massive cannons and massive guns so far. This is the biggest and most dangerous obstacle in the series so far, a simple knife. But then George interrupts. He sees the confrontation and sides with Dio, handing the power straight back to him, and Dio continues to control the narrative. Dio has not spent his anger though. Jonathan has enraged him by striking a clean blow, so Dio must express his anger, and he commits the worst crime seen in the series to date. The death of Danny was an action of pure spitefulness. This wasn't a part of Dio's grand plan. It was revenge for a fair fight lost. This act does bring a realization, not to Jonathan, but to Dio himself. He needs to control his temper or risk being exposed. This pattern seemingly continues. Dio is in control of everything other than the title of the story. But the title is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So at some point, Jonathan is going to have to act instead of reacting. A lot of shows have a time skip, and JoJo is no different. It's a perfect plot device in order to speed up the narrative or make the narrative you've been experiencing so far seem like a backstory. During the time skip, Dio has formed a fake friendship with JoJo, as he thinks building trust with Jonathan will actually help deceive him. So Dio has manufactured this relationship and shows us something interesting. The two main characters are predicted as star players in a rugby match. An unstoppable duo equals. We see Dio's growth as he is much stronger than we last saw, but not only that, Jonathan has not only become a tank, but has been allowed to picture Dio as an equal. For the rest of the time in this story, he has some agency within it, and that pattern continues. As stated, during this time, Dio has formed a fake relationship with Jonathan in order to try to deceive him further. But Jonathan seems to see through this, at least a little, giving him the benefit of the doubt, but not fully forgetting the past they share. We learn that Dio has been working on a modified plan to steal the Joestar fortune. He's only waited to this point, as now he is of age to claim the fortune for himself. When they return home, we as the audience find out that in the past 7 years, George has fallen ill. George says that his doctors want him to go to the hospital, but Dio protests, stating, "The hospital is in terrible shape, they only want our money. That's why he wants you to go." George agrees and stays home. I think it's interesting that Dio uses the word "our money" here. It shows that he might already see the money as his own, but one thing is clear, that Dio has a motive to keep George here, and Jonathan picks up on that. He also reflects that he should have been studying medicine rather than archaeology, as then he might be able to help his father. I think this is really important. Another mirror showing the difference in their goals and needs. Jonathan shows remorse for not being in the position to save his father, while Dio continues to spin his web of lies to get what he wants. In the next scene, Jonathan is studying the stone mask, knowing it reacts to blood, but trying to figure out its true purpose. A lot of this scene was cut out from the anime. Jonathan mentions his mother and her link to the mask, and reflects on his past studies. but what wasn't removed, finding the letter from Dio's father. The letter speaks not only of the favor George Joestar owes Dio's father, but the symptoms of the sickness that killed him. It lists the exact same symptoms as his own father. Dio is in control of everything other than the title. He's going to have to start acting instead of reacting. The title is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. In this moment, Jonathan for the first time has the power. Jonathan starts acting and Dio reacting, trying to play into the false friendship he's built with Jonathan, saying not trusting Dio now will destroy the friendship that they have built. Jonathan, being a warm-hearted fool, tells Dio that if he can swear on his dead father's honor, he will forget this ever happened and trust him. Dio's pride is too much. For the second time in this story, it is his folly. You think that piece of crap had an ounce of honor? He then strikes Jonathan when Jonathan refuses, which does not faze him in the slightest, instead helping Jonathan fully realize and reaffirm his resolve. Jonathan knows the truth. This is the moment when the second Joestar was born. That punch gave birth to Jonathan Joestar.